The year is 1962. The world watches, holding its breath. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a standoff between superpowers, a nuclear showdown. The fate of mankind hangs precariously in the balance. The United States discovers Soviet nuclear missiles stationed in Cuba, a mere 90 miles from American shores. Fear grips the nation. President John F. Kennedy faces an impossible choice. Military action seems inevitable. The world braces for war. Kennedy's decision sends shockwaves through Washington. The world gasps. His advisors are stunned. The military brass is apoplectic. Accusations of weakness and appeasement fill the air. But Kennedy stands firm. He knows the risks of confrontation, the potential for catastrophic miscalculation. He believes in the power of dialogue, the possibility of peaceful resolution. Kennedy addresses the nation. His voice, calm but firm, resonates through the airwaves. He explains his decision, his belief in diplomacy over aggression. He speaks of the horrors of nuclear war, the need for restraint and understanding. He calls for a new era of diplomacy, a world where dialogue triumphs over destruction. The world celebrated the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, unaware of the delicate dance happening behind the scenes. The agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev was not a simple handshake on the world stage. It was a clandestine operation, a series of hushed phone calls and secret backroom deals. The removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba was public knowledge, a victory trumpeted by both sides. But the removal of American missiles from Turkey remained a closely guarded secret, known only to a handful of advisors in both Washington and Moscow. The removal of the Jupiter missiles from Turkey was a calculated gamble by Kennedy. He understood that the move would be seen by some as a sign of weakness, a concession to Soviet pressure. He anticipated the backlash from hardliners within his own government and the military establishment. But Kennedy believed, fundamentally, that the risk of nuclear war far outweighed any political cost. In the aftermath of the crisis, Kennedy faced the daunting task of selling his brand of peace to a world still reeling from the near-death experience of nuclear confrontation. He understood that the threat was far from over, that the Cold War was a long-distance race that required patience, resolve, and a fundamental belief in the power of diplomacy. He knew that his actions had challenged the prevailing orthodoxy, the belief that strength was measured in megatons, not in restraint. Kennedy embarked on a public relations offensive both at home and abroad. He delivered speeches, granted interviews, and wrote articles, all with the aim of explaining his vision of a world where diplomacy, not military might, was the primary tool of international relations. He spoke of the need for dialogue, for understanding, for finding common ground even with adversaries. He argued that true strength lay not in the ability to inflict destruction, but in the courage to choose peace. With the immediate threat of nuclear war receding, a cautious optimism spread through the United States. The Cuban Missile Crisis, though terrifying, had a strangely unifying effect. It was a stark reminder of shared vulnerability, a moment when political differences seemed to fade in the face of existential danger. Kennedy, sensing this shift, seized the opportunity to advance his domestic agenda. He believed that the nation, having stared into the abyss, was ready for a new era of progress and social change. Kennedy's vision extended beyond civil rights. He believed that America, having proven its mettle in the crucible of the Cold War, could achieve anything it set its mind to. He challenged the nation to embrace a new frontier, a future defined by scientific exploration, social progress, and economic opportunity. He called for a renewed focus on education, on innovation, on lifting up the poor and marginalized. The thawing of Cold War tensions, initiated by the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, created an unexpected opportunity for international cooperation. Kennedy, emboldened by his success in averting nuclear war, saw a chance to build on this momentum. He believed that the two superpowers, despite their ideological differences, could find common ground in their shared humanity and their desire for a safer world. Despite the optimism surrounding the easing of Cold War tensions, the world remained a dangerous place. Old hatreds died hard, and new threats emerged from the shadows. The specter of nuclear war may have receded, but the possibility of conflict, of miscalculation, of unforeseen consequences still loomed large. The Khrushchev thaw, a balancing act. In the heart of the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev navigated a political landscape as treacherous as the frozen Siberian tundra. His decision to back down during the Cuban Missile Crisis, while presented as a victory to the Soviet people, had sown seeds of discontent among the party elite. He was a reformer at heart, a man who had witnessed firsthand the inefficiencies and brutality of Stalin's regime. He believed that the Soviet Union's future lay not in military confrontation with the West, but in economic modernization and a more open society. Seeds of doubt. The hardliners push back. Khrushchev's reforms, though well-intentioned, faced resistance from entrenched interests within the Soviet bureaucracy. The old guard, accustomed to the rigidities of central planning, saw his reforms as a threat to their power and privilege. They dragged their feet, resisted change, and whispered their doubts in the corridors of power. Trading missiles for tractors, a nation transformed. Khrushchev's decision to prioritize economic development over military expansion had a profound impact on Soviet society. Resources that had once been funneled into the military-industrial complex were redirected towards agriculture, consumer goods, and infrastructure. The Soviet people, long accustomed to shortages and deprivation, began to experience a slow but steady rise in their standard of living. Across the Atlantic, the echoes of Kennedy's diplomacy reverberated through the halls of European capitals. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a stark reminder of the continent's vulnerability at the front lines of the Cold War, spurred a new urgency for unity and self-determination. The specter of nuclear annihilation had a sobering effect, pushing European leaders to reevaluate their dependence on superpower politics and chart a course towards a more integrated future. In the volatile cauldron of the Middle East, Kennedy's commitment to peaceful resolution had unexpected consequences. The region, long a battleground for proxy wars and superpower competition, found itself at a crossroads. The absence of aggressive Cold War meddling created a vacuum, a space for regional powers to explore new avenues for dialogue and cooperation. The ripple effects of Kennedy's diplomacy extended southward, reaching the shores of Latin America. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a stark reminder of the region's vulnerability to superpower manipulation, fueled a wave of anti-imperialist sentiment. Across the continent, from the bustling streets of Buenos Aires to the mountainous villages of the Andes, a new generation of leaders emerged, determined to chart a course independent of both Washington and Moscow. The world continued to spin, its axis no longer solely defined by the bipolar tension of the Cold War. Kennedy's legacy, a tapestry woven from threads of diplomacy and a steadfast belief in humanity's potential, cast a long shadow. The generations that came of age in the shadow of the averted Cuban Missile Crisis carried with them a different perspective, one tempered by the understanding that dialogue, not destruction, held the key to a shared future. The gradual thawing of the Cold War ushered in a new era of global competition, one where the battleground shifted from military arsenals to the frontiers of science and technology. With the threat of nuclear annihilation receding, both the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves with an opportunity to redirect their vast resources toward more constructive pursuits. The space race, once a symbol of Cold War rivalry, evolved into a testament to humanity's shared ambition to explore the unknown. The long thaw of the Cold War, while ushering in an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity, came at a cost. As the threat of global conflict receded, so too did the urgency to invest in certain areas of national security, particularly those deemed less relevant in a world where diplomacy reigned supreme. The focus on traditional military strength, on the hardware of war, waned, creating blind spots in the global security apparatus. The new millennium dawned bright with promise. The Cold War was a fading memory, relegated to history books and grainy archival footage. The United States and the former Soviet Union, once locked in a deadly embrace, now stood as partners, their shared humanity eclipsing decades of mistrust. Kennedy's vision, once deemed idealistic by some, had largely materialized. The world was a different place. In the aftermath of the attacks, as the dust settled and the world mourned the loss of innocent lives, a profound question hung in the air. Had the long peace, the era ushered in by Kennedy's courageous decision to choose diplomacy over destruction, inadvertently paved the way for this new, insidious form of warfare?